Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Congressional Debate How-To series. This is Murtaza Kazmi, back at it again with a new video, this time on evidence and analysis. Now, this is the meat of your speech, so really pay attention to this lecture. And I guess let's begin. So let's start off first for the uninitiated with some definitions. Evidence and data, these are interchangeable terms. Some people might also use cards. That's more of a public forum, Lincoln Douglas term, but whatever floats your boat, I guess. So what these terms collectively mean is outside evidence you use to support your point. Why is that relevant? Because you have a burden of proof, right? It would be great if society just only accepted claims. But obviously, we're not going to do that because people can lie, people can cheat, people can misconstrue. So you need to have evidence from outside sources that show that what you're saying does have merit from other people, especially relevant people in whatever field of study that you're trying to reference. So the key thing here is outside evidence and supporting your point, right? Now, what about analysis? Well, analysis is always tied to evidence in some capacity, and it's an explanation of why your data supports your point. So the way to think about it is that you have your data, and your data is from an outside source, so it's not directly relevant per se to your speech. What your analysis does is it forms kind of a glue between your evidence on one hand and the rest of your speech or your point on the other hand, showing the link between the two. It's kind of similar in a way to the link between the AGD and the thesis in your introduction, if you guys remember from one of our past videos, and that the link shows what connection there is, thus strengthening the relationship between the evidence and the rest of the speech, or in the previous case, between the attention-getting device and the thesis and the rest of the introduction. So those two are always going to be linked. Analysis needs evidence, evidence needs analysis. But let's get started with a closer look at what evidence is. So there's really two types of acceptable evidence, in my opinion, and that is with a quantification or a substantiation. So a quantification is a specific number. That's like a quantity. That's what the root word is. So a specific number to back up your point. So when you use any sort of statistic, any sort of number, that is a quantification. And this is going to be the most common type of evidence that you'll often use. The other type of evidence you can use is called substantiation. And that means that a factual statement that cannot be quantified, right? So as of recording this video, Joe Biden is the president of the United States of America. There's no way to really quantify that. I guess you could say he's like whatever number president he is, but really that's just a factual statement that really cannot be disputed. Joe Biden, or I guess it could be disputed if you have different political leanings, but we'll cover that later, hopefully. So as of right now, factually, Joe Biden is the president of the United States. So you could include that as a substantiation piece of evidence in your speech, because again, there's no way to quantify it. That's just like an objective fact. More apt ways of substantiating in your speech is often like looking at a constitution, at a law, and getting a professor to say like, no, this is what it says, right? Not their opinion. That's something we'll cover later. We do not want to use opinions, expert opinions, but you can say that like, no, factually, this is what the law does, for example. There's no way to quantify it, but it's just a fact. As I kind of foreshadowed earlier, we're not going to have any opinions, no inferences, no data without context, and no expert testimonials. Anything that can be viewed as somewhat of an opinion or somewhat of a, I think this might happen, don't include it. We want to stick to the quantified data and the substantiated data, the factual statements and the numbers from different academic studies or whatnot. That's what we want to use to prove our point. Otherwise, it won't make sense, right? Usually these sources are going to end with a .edu or .gov because that's what is relevant. And we could also use Google Scholar. Google Scholar is a fantastic source of information to find these kind of higher level type studies. So I would always recommend that you guys go towards that. So what are some examples of good sources? Well, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, government statistics, academic journals and publications, studies, or international weekly magazines, right? The Economist, things like that, and newspapers, New York Times, etc. What these sources have some level of credibility, and they've also been listed in the order of their credibility, I would say. Um, you always should try and rely more on government statistics or academic journals, think tanks, these kind of organizations. Um, but yeah, they have a level of credibility. They have a level of expertise. They have the most experienced people in the field working on these journals, on these articles, on these essays. So referencing them is going to sound really good. Also, a quick note, you can also use books. Books are a fantastic source of information. This is more relevant to extent, I would say, but if you guys are feeling a bit adventurous, start reading some books. You can always reference a book in your study. Obviously not like Harry Potter or something, but like something relevant to whatever you're talking about. All right, so what are bad sources then? Anything on TV, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, these kind of things. Don't use them. Personal websites, also kind of bad. There are blogs, anyone can write on them. I could start up a personal website if I wanted to and start writing. It doesn't make my analysis or my evidence any clearer. Any student written thing, again, same idea. Some of you guys are seniors. Next year, you guys could be writing student written works. So don't cite them, right? Clickbait, fake news, I think those are kind of self-explanatory. And the other biggest thing I can say, never, ever, ever falsify evidence. First, aside from just like the congressional debate of it, just look at the morals of it. Just don't, I hope that you guys can find evidence. I don't think Congress or any sort of debate should be enough to compromise morals or justice. So just don't falsify evidence just straight up, okay? Generally, I would say finding evidence first and then making your points, right? Because if you do it the other way around, there may not be evidence to support your point. You may fall under bias just to say, oh, I really like this point, so let me try and find some evidence for it. No, you always are going to do your background research, find your evidence first, and then make your point. And I'll cover this more in depth when I talk about how I would make speeches and how I would recommend you all to make speeches as well. Okay, so now that you found your evidence, what about citing this evidence, okay? Well, we want to include the source of the data, right? The Economist, New York Times, Center for American Progress, whatever it is, and the date, day, month, and year. And if the day is not available, then just month and year is fine. You can use the author's credentials if it is a bad source, right? Just because it's a bad source doesn't mean that the person writing it is bad, especially on the personal websites and stuff. If some very foremost expert on the field just happens to have a personal blog and starts writing foreign policy papers on it, it's fine to cite the author himself or herself or themselves, right? That's completely valid. Sometimes the same article is published multiple sources, cite the most reliable one. Again, Fox News could reference an article from the Brookings Institution. Do not cite Fox News, cite the Brookings Institution, things like that. Just realize that the same article, same information is usually posted in multiple different ways. Find the one that makes the most sense, that sounds kind of the nicest, I guess. Like I mentioned before, dates at least month and year. This is a given. You cannot waver on this. Include the day if applicable. I would always recommend including the day as well. Okay, what about a closer look at analysis? This is going to be relatively quick because it's also a bit self-explanatory. It's just basically like the link. There are two types of analysis that we can use. Orienting, which is signposting your data. So we're previewing the evidence. This usually comes before the evidence. So for example, after your claim, you can be like, but this is not just me saying it. Look to evidence in the field from this particular author, and then you go into your evidence, or you preview what the point is about to say. Like you can say, but it's not just an issue of foreign policy. It's particularly related to this country. And then you have this card that says why this country is messed up, for example, right? Orienting is always going to come before the evidence. Like the name suggests, it orients the audience towards what you're about to say in the evidence. And it's pretty effective. Summarizing, signposting your impact after summarizing your point, right? So this is before the impact, after the evidence, kind of giving a quick summary, idea of what the evidence just says and why it's relevant to the point. So the ways to articulate this debate impact, because that's what summarizing basically is that so when we pass this legislation, fiat just assumes that it does pass, right? And do what the legislation says, which is the legislative function, right? We cause this effect, which is the linked like claim, which leads to this, and this is the impact, right? Or this is one method of displaying the impact. So using this sentence is going to bring you a lot of success because it's so easy to understand. So when we pass this legislation and do what the legislation says, we cause this effect, which leads to this, right? And obviously input whatever you need to put in there, right? So this is a great sentence structure to use to include in your speech right before you're about to say your impact, and we'll cover that in the next lecture a little bit more. Analysis provides transitions and logic to speeches. This is one of the big takeaways that I want you guys to have about analysis. Analysis is what you are saying, right? Explaining why things are happening, explaining, transitioning into different points in your speech. This is what makes it not just a recitation of evidence. Analysis is what makes it a speech, right? So it's really important that you master analysis by continuing to use it, orienting right before your evidence, summarizing before your impact, or immediately after your evidence. Evidence should always be followed by analysis. That is just always going to be the case. And if it doesn't, then there's something wrong with the speech. All right. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture on evidence and analysis. Next time we'll talk about impacts, which is a fundamental aspect of congressional debate. But for now, this is Murtaza Cosby signing off. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you.